Hello, welcome to the session. My name is Jesse Walker. I'm an editor at Reason Magazine. I also wrote this book, The United States of Paranoia. I'm going to talk a bit about the stuff that's in that book. And I'm going to start by taking you back to January 30th, 1835, a day when Andrew Jackson was exiting a congressman's funeral, and an assassin drew a weapon and pointed it at the president. The pistol misfired. The gunman pulls a second weapon, and it's loaded, but it too fails to fire. Jackson wields his cane, and along with several bystanders, subdues the would-be killer. This was in the days of the do-it-yourself Secret Service. And the guy turns out to be an unemployed house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence. Lawrence later informed interrogator that he was King Richard III, that Jackson had killed his father, and that with Jackson dead, money would be more plenty. He was judged insane. They put him in an asylum. He died there 3 decades later. Lawrence was a lone nut. Or that was the official story. It wasn't long before 2 witnesses filed affidavits claiming to have seen Lawrence at the home of the Mississippi Senator George Poindexter shortly before the attack. Poindexter was a noisy opponent of the Jackson administration, and various pro-Jackson newspapers accused the senator of plotting the president's murder. So did Jackson's allies in Congress, who quickly convened an investigation. Jackson himself told bystanders after the assault that the shooter had been, quote, hired by that damned rascal Poindexter to assassinate me. Some of Jackson's critics countered with their own conspiracy theories, suggesting that the assault was a false flag operation staged by the president to gain public support, and that this was why both of the guns failed to fire. And many Jacksonians pointed their finger at John Calhoun, the former vice president, then the senator from South Carolina, arguing that if he had been not directly involved in the assassination attempt, he had at the very least incited it with a speech denouncing Jackson as an American Caesar. When the Republican writer John Smith Dye described the crime 29 years later, long after all those investigations had dribbled out with nothing to show for it, he saw an even more devilish plot at work. Calhoun might not have been directly involved in the assault, Dye conceded. But then again, maybe he was. And at any rate, Calhoun was part of a larger force, a Southern cabal called the Slave Power, that would have benefited if Jackson had been put in the ground. And the slave power, Dye was sure, was more than willing to kill a powerful man if he stood in their way. And if you're a fan of sort of 1970s conspiracy movies like The Parallax View, you're about to hear the antebellum equivalent. In 1841, President William Henry Harrison told Calhoun that he wasn't sure he was willing to annex Texas, which the Southerners wanted to add to the Union as a slave state. And Harrison promptly died. Now, officially, the cause of death was pneumonia, but Dye was sure, John Smith Dye was sure, that arsenic was to blame. 9 years later, Dye continued, President Zachary Taylor opposed the slave power's agenda in Cuba and the Southwest, and so he was killed by the same poison. Dye also believed that when President-elect James Buchanan prepared to make some appointments that the slavocrats disapproved of, he narrowly escaped death via one of the most elaborate plots ever conceived. On February 23, 1857, according to Dye, Southern agents poisoned all the bowls containing lump sugar at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C. Southerners, Dye explained, drink coffee, and coffee drinkers use pulverized sugar. So if you poison the lump sugar, the Southern diners aren't going to die, but the tea-drinking Northern diners, including Buchanan, would be wiped out. The future president barely survived the illness that followed. Intimidated by the attempted assassination, Dye wrote, Buchanan became more than ever the tool of the slave power. Now, I won't keep you in suspense. There's not much evidence for Dye's explosive charges. You can make a case that Harrison's doctors did more to hurt than to help the ailing president, but no more than conjecture supports the idea that anyone deliberately killed him as opposed to not being good doctors. Coroners debunked the Zachary Taylor theory when his body was exhumed in 1991, and Buchanan wasn't even present in Washington on February 23, 1857, though dysentery did break out at the hotel when Buchanan stayed there a month earlier. and again when he returned for his inauguration. And today those outbreaks are usually attributed to a sewage backup that contaminated the inn's food and water, but at the time all sorts of conspiracy stories were circulating, blaming everyone from a Chinese cabal to a group of homicidal abolitionists. Inconveniently for the whole sugar theory, tea and coffee, the dead included a Southern congressman, John Quitman of Mississippi. But Dye was full of it. But when his book, The Adder's Den, was published in 1864, the country was at war with the South. And when an expanded edition appeared 2 years later, under the lengthy title, History of the Plots and Crimes of the Great Conspiracy to Overthrow Liberty in America, the nation was still reeling from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And in that atmosphere, Dye's book received a respectful notice in the New York Times. It was excerpted in the Chicago Tribune. Republican papers praised it in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Trenton, and New York City. And in Pennsylvania, even the Democratic Easton Express proclaimed it, quote, the most powerful book of the century. And Dye didn't invent his theories from nothing. He was drawing on rumors that had been floating through Whig and Republican circles for years. After Lincoln was elected, well before Dye's book appeared, several supporters of the incoming president sent letters warning him to watch out for the plotters who had killed two of his predecessors. One citizen wrote, General Harrison lived but a short time after he was installed in office, and General Taylor lived but a short time after he took his seat. You, sir, be careful at the king's table what meat and drink you take. And another letter informed Lincoln, I have often heard it stated by physicians that it was an undoubted fact that our last two Whig presidents, Generals Harrison and Taylor, came to their sudden and lamentable ends by subtle poisons, that's underlined, so I'm trying to say poisons, administered in their food at the White House. After Lincoln died, more than one minister worked the supposed murders of Harrison and Taylor into their sermons. Reverend Henry Ward Beecher not only invoked their alleged assassinations in an article for the New York Ledger, but added the anti-secessionist Democrat Stephen Douglas to the list of alleged victims. During the effort to impeach Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's Southern successor, Congressman James Mitchell Ashley brought up the same old accusations. He declared that Harrison, Taylor, and Buchanan had been, quote, poisoned for the expressed purpose of putting the vice presidents in the presidential office. And in May 1868, an extraordinary article appeared in the New York Tribune that managed to outdo Dye, accusing a Democratic conspiracy of engineering the city's malaria outbreaks. After commenting that Zachary Taylor fell under the malarious vapors of Washington and died because he was prone to acting honestly and straightforward, the Tribune writer claimed that Washington in subsequent years was free of malaria, that is, for Democrats. But when the new Republican Party began to gain strength, and it was possible that they might become the ruling power in Congress, the water of Washington suddenly grew dangerous. The hotels, particularly the National, became pest houses, and dozens of heretics from the Democratic faith grew sick almost unto death. The contagions continued until Lincoln put the walls and springs of the Capitol under the care of loyal soldiers, ending the outbreaks. But after Lincoln was deposed, the pattern returned, and we had a return of that bad water. And 2 or 3 senators, Republicans, mind you, are prostrated with Southern illness. What does it mean? Why does it happen that whenever the current sets against the master demon of slavery, and never at any other time, we find the air and the water and the whiskey of Washington full of poison? And I really want to have like a show on cable, not for me, someone to call like the air, the water, and the whiskey of Washington. I think that would be a great name. So, and the assassination theorists were not the only Americans worried about conspiracies of slaveholders. Lincoln himself believed that he could clearly see a, quote, powerful plot to make slavery universal and perpetual. And his famous House Divided speech, if you read it, is actually filled with conspiratorial speculations. Senator Henry Wilson, who later served as vice president, put the idea pretty bluntly. He said, slavery organized conspiracies in the cabinet, conspiracies in Congress, conspiracies in the states, conspiracies in the army, conspiracies in the navy, conspiracies everywhere for the overthrow of the government and the disruption of the republic. And meanwhile, Southerners had elaborate conspiracy theories of their own. blaming slave revolts, both real ones and imagined ones, on the machinations of rebellion-stoking abolitionists, treacherous land pirates, and other outside agitators. So it was a paranoid time, but in America it is always a paranoid time. Pundits tend to write off political paranoia as a feature of the fringe, a disorder that occasionally flares up until the sober center can put out the flames, but they're wrong. The fear of conspiracies has been a potent force across the political spectrum, from the colonial era to the present, in the establishment as well as the extremes. Conspiracy theories played major roles in conflicts from the Indian Wars of the 17th century to the War on Terror today. They have been popular not just with dissenters and nonconformists, but with individuals and institutions at the center of power. They are not simply a colorful historical byway, they are at the country's core. Now, unfortunately, much of the public perception of political paranoia seems frozen in 1964. That's when the historian Richard Hofstadter published The Paranoid Style in American Politics, a very famous essay, which set out to describe what he called a state of mind marked by heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial frenzy. And he detected it in movements ranging from the anti-Masonic and anti-Catholic crusades of the 19th century to various left-wing and right-wing folks at the time that he was writing in the early 60s. Now, there's been half a century of scholarship since then that has built on, refuted, and otherwise amended various ideas in Hofstadter's piece, but that work doesn't get nearly as much attention as The Paranoid Style does. And that's too bad. The essay does contain some real insights, but it also declared that political paranoia is, quote, the preferred style only of minority movements, and just to marginalize that minority some more, that it has, quote, a greater affinity for bad causes than good. An earlier version of his article, Hofstadter went further, claiming that the paranoid style usually affects only, quote, a modest minority of the population, even if under certain circumstances it can, quote, more readily be built into mass movements or political parties. But educated elites have conspiracy theories too. I'm not just talking about the times when someone who's powerful signs on to sort of a fringy theory. It's sort of famous that Bill Clinton asked Webster Hubbell when he came into office, I want you to find two things out if you go to justice. Who killed Kennedy and are UFOs real? You know, and Richard Nixon was a bit of a Vince Foster theorist. So you have things like that, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about conspiracy theories that are embraced by the center and the establishment, mass media and or government. Consider the phenomenon of the moral panic. It's a time when fear and hysteria are magnified, distorted, perhaps even created by influential social institutions. Stanley Cohen didn't coin the phrase. He was a British sociologist, but he was the first to use it systematically, and in 1972 he sketched sort of the standard progression of a moral panic, whether it was about anything from, you know, the rockers and the mods to LSD. Let me find the quote. A condition, episode, person, or a group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Its nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by mass media. The moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. Socially accredited experts pronounce their diagnoses and solutions. Ways of coping are evolved or more often resorted to. The condition then disappears, submerges, or deteriorates and becomes more visible. And an essential feature of a moral panic is what Cohen calls the folk devil. And the folk devil is an evil agent who serves as a scapegoat for the threat, and the folk devil often takes the form of a conspiracy. It could be a satanic cult, a powerful gang, a backwoods militia. The anti-prostitution panic of the early 20th century, for example, featured lurid tales of a vast international white slavery syndicate conscripting thousands of innocent girls each year into sexual service. An influential book by a former Chicago prosecutor at the time, it was called The Girl Who Disappeared, claimed in the space of just 3 paragraphs that the syndicate amounted to an invisible government, a hidden hand, and a secret power. And he said in the same time that behind our city and state governments there is an unseen power which controls them. Now, coerced prostitution did really exist. It did really exist, but it was neither as prevalent nor as organized as that kind of wild rhetoric suggested. But far from being consigned to a marginal movement, as Hofstadter would have suggested, the scare led to a major piece of national legislation, the Mann Act of 1910, and it gave the first major boost in power to the agency that would later be known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Within a decade, the Bureau would be extending its purview from alleged conspiracies of pimps to alleged conspiracies of communists, getting another boost in power in the process. And after he took over, J. Edgar Hoover was very good at playing that game. You know, now he's going after the far right, now he's going after the far left, always finding ways to turn whatever the paranoid moment was into a way of expanding his bureaucracy's power. But stories like that are missing from Richard Hofstadter's famous essay. The Paranoid Style drew almost all of his examples, all but one, and it's sort of a peculiar exception, from movements that were opposed to the quote-unquote right-thinking people that Stanley Cohen mentioned in his definition of moral panic as manning the barricades against the folk devils. So the result in Hofstadter was a distorted picture in which the country's outsiders are possessed by fear and its establishment usually is not. The essay had room, for example, for what's the quote? Greenback and populist writers who constructed a great conspiracy of international bankers, but the essay said nothing about the elites of the era who perceived populism as the product of a conspiracy. I'll give you a more recent example of that kind of mirroring. This comes way after Hofstadter, but involves people who quote Hofstadter a lot. In June of 2009, you may remember, an 88-year-old neo-Nazi named James Winokur von Brunn entered the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and he opened fire. And he killed a security guard. That came 10 days after the murder of the abortion doctor George Tiller in Kansas. And the two crimes wound up getting linked in this kind of free associative way into a pattern of rising right-wing violence. And some pundits tried to tie the slayings to a smattering of other crimes, many dating back to the Bush administration, which were linked only by the fact that the criminals all hailed from one corner or another of the radical right, the paranoid right, as it's often called. But the critics of the paranoid right turned out to be pretty paranoid too. Having established this crime wave to their satisfaction, the analysts quickly moved on to denouncing the unindicted instigators they blamed for it. Bonnie Irby of U.S. News and World Report pinned the museum's guard on promoters of hate and said the shooting was a clarion call for banning hate speech. In the New York Times, Bob Herbert wrote that he can't help thinking that the crimes were just the beginning and that worse is to come, and that this was thanks in part to the over-the-top rhetoric of the National Rifle Association. Paul Krugman warned that right-wing extremism is being systematically fed by the conservative media and political establishment. The narrative was clear. The right-wing media was responsible for right-wing violence, and right-wing violence was on the rise. So with that story in mind, let me show you a chart. This is from a paper that was published earlier this year by the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. It counts all the violent right-wing incidents known to have happened in the U.S. each year. We're talking everything from vandalism to the Oklahoma City bombing. The first thing you'll probably notice is that this shaded part over on the right-hand side is a lot taller than the shaded part on the left-hand side, and a lot of the media reaction to the paper focused on that, though if they looked closer, they would have seen that the author of the paper actually mentioned that that has a lot to do with the fact that there's a lot better data now. They only started asking police agencies to start keeping track of hate crimes and the like early on. But if it's tricky what I want to actually focus on here is 2009, when all those voices in the media were talking about rising right-wing violence, and we see it going down. And then 2010, remember, there was the furor over a health care bill and the warnings that Tea Partiers were going to turn into stormtroopers, and it keeps going actually down. This is like the most interesting rise in violence I've ever seen. Finally, in 2011, there's an uptick, just like you have upticks in other years before national elections. The author of the paper thinks that might be a pattern that happens around election time. Maybe. You'll notice 1996, it doesn't happen. He says maybe that's because nobody really cared who won in 96, which might be true. Bob Dole was running. I don't think he cared. But at any rate, my point isn't to theorize about what explains these zigs and zags. It's just to show you that this downward slope happened in the exact 2 years when everyone was telling us to expect an upward slope. It was the story that we heard was a remarkable reversal of the reality on the ground. It was paranoid. And as anyone who's ever read a comment thread about, the Koch brothers on a liberal blog can tell you, it's the kind of paranoia that can frequently turn into conspiracy theories. I wrote this book. It's got two big themes. The first one I mentioned earlier, it's that conspiracy theories aren't just a fringe thing, that people in power can be paranoid too. And the other is that we can learn a lot from conspiracy theories, even when they are not accurate. Some conspiracy stories are accurate, of course. I've got a chapter in here about the revelations of the 1970s, when all sorts of ugly facts about the CIA and the FBI and the IRS and the NSA came out. A couple of those initials may sound familiar from recent stories, so this is not something that only happens in the 1970s. But even when a conspiracy story is not accurate at all, it says something true about the anxieties and the experiences of the people who believe and repeat it, even if it says nothing true about the objects of the theory itself. And when people try to talk about political paranoia while ignoring those facts, I think you get really one-dimensional discussions of the subject. In my book, I set out to get past that. I hope I got at least a bit past it in my talk here today.